going through the ball. This episode, part 2 of our background episode, this week,
As I've said elsewhere, abrasives are the biggest consumable cost in the shop of most knife makers, and the biggest chunk of that money goes towards grinder belts. Now, the first question most people ask when they're about to buy a belt grinder is, how long will the belts last? The smart aleck answer is, not long enough. Before we even attempt to answer the question seriously, though, let's talk about the various kinds of belts available out there. The most basic abrasive available is aluminum oxide. It's not super hard, but it's fairly cheap. Of all the abrasives out there, aluminum oxide, often called AO, is probably the one that lasts the shortest amount of time. But, on the good side, it's also the cheapest. Other abrasives available include ceramics such as Norton's Norzon belts. Silicon carbide belts are also available. Sometimes higher grits are found on plastic and fiber belts. Fine grit plastic belts leave a nice finish, but in my experience they wear out in about 8 seconds. For higher grit finishes, I like 3M Try Zack Belts, a so-called structured abrasive in which fresh abrasive is designed to be brought to the surface as higher layers of abrasive break down. In the fine grit Try Zack belts, this is done by impregnating the abrasives into a fiber belt. I find these last a really long time. Confusingly, 3M also markets a totally different belt under the Try Zack name that they call Gator Grit. The Gator Grit belt works by having big piles of abrasives that slowly wear away. They cost about 3 times what the El Cheapo AO belts do, and they also have a different grinding effect. One thing about them is that if you dig a pointy part of your work into them, you'll strip off a lot of abrasive and ruin the belts. But I like them for grinding delicate straight lines, as for instance when you're grinding the shinogi bevel on Japanese blades, or when you're grinding double-edged European blades with a ridge down the center. There are a number of other kinds of belts, some of which thrive under really hard pressure. If you grind blades in a semi-production manner, these might be the best for you. Bottom line, when you start out, you need to get a good supply of belts. You'll run through them a lot faster than you wish you would. For most makers, the 60 grit belt is going to be your workhorse for shaping. You'll probably go through 3 times as many 60 grit belts as you will of any other grit. Some people prefer 40 grit belts for their foundation grinding. Nothing wrong with that. Each to his own. So, if you're buying a grinder, I recommend buying 10 or 20 cheap aluminum oxide belts in 60 grit, 10 belts in 120 grit, 10 belts in 220 grit, and then experiment with a bunch of different kinds of fine grit belts. I also recommend that you buy a couple of 60 grit belts in every type that you can lay your hands on. Everybody has a different touch on the grinder, and everybody makes different kinds of knives. So what works for you might not work for me. What do I use? Mostly the cheapest AO belts that I can find. Do they wear out fast? Yeah, but they cost me about 1/3 what I'd pay for, say, ceramic belts, and for me, the math works out. For you, it might not. So try them all.